Welcome to this day in his story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that the USS Ranger took 3 years to build and was the largest aircraft carrier in the U.S. Atlantic Fleet during World War II? Learn how the USS Ranger transported aircraft to West African bases and launched planes that were used to attack German shipping along the Norwegian coast. Discover how the USS Ranger completed a total of 14,863 day and night carrier landings between August 1944 and February 1945.
I want you to try something for me. Close your eyes for a second.
Unless you're driving, of course.
Right. Yeah, if you're driving, please keep them on the road. But if you are somewhere safe, try to conjure up the image of an aircraft carrier in your mind.
Just picture it.
When we see them on the news today, what do we actually see?
Well, we see floating cities, really.
Exactly. We see these absolute behemoths, the Gerald R. Ford class, nuclear-powered, 5,000 people on board, enough firepower to basically level a small nation.
And they feel permanent, like they've just always been the apex predators of the ocean.
Right, like it was inevitable, like the Navy just drew a blueprint in 1920 and bam, supercarrier. But the reality is so much messier and honestly, a lot more interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
So today we are doing a deep dive into that origin story. We're looking at the USS Ranger, specifically designated CB4, and looking at the stack of sources we have today, from operational logs to architectural breakdowns, and even a really unexpected philosophical tract included in the file. This is definitely not just a story about a boat.
No, it is a story about evolution. It's about trial and error. The Ranger is essentially the missing link in naval history.
It's the moment the U.S. Navy decided to, stop improvising and start actually engineering. Because before the Ranger, aircraft carriers were basically Frankenstein monsters, weren't they?
That is a very fair description. I mean, if you look at the predecessors, CV-1, the Langley, or the famous Lexington and Saratoga, those did not start their lives as carriers.
Right.
They were converted. The Langley was a collier, which is a coal ship. The others were battle cruiser hulls that got repurposed because of international naval treaties. So they were retrofits.
So they were basically taking existing hulls, chopping off the top, and just
slapping a flat deck on it.
Wow.
Precisely. They were making the best of what they had. But the Ranger, which was commissioned in the early 30s, was different. And this is the phrase the sources just keep hammering home. Keel up.
Keel up.
The Ranger was the first U.S. ship built from the keel up, specifically to launch and recover aircraft.
So our mission today is to track that exact evolution. We're going to follow the Ranger from being this weird 1930s experiment through the freezing waters of the Atlantic in World War II to its final role as a high-intensity classroom.
And then we have to tackle that curveball in the source material.
Oh, we will. That comparison between naval preparedness and spiritual preparedness.
Which, I have to say, offers a really fascinating window into the mindset of the era. It takes the hardware of the ship and connects it to the software of the human operating system, so to speak.
It really does. But let's start with the metal. Let's go back to February 25, 1933. The Ranger launches. It's commissioned a year later, June 4th, 1934. What made this design so radical compared to those converted coal ships?
Well, it was an exercise in compromise and ambition. You have to remember the context here, the Washington Naval Treaty.
True, the interwar period.
Exactly. The world powers were actively trying to limit the size of navies to prevent another Great War. So the U.S. had a strictly limited amount of tonnage they were allowed to use for carriers. They wanted to squeeze as much air power as physically possible into a relatively small package.
So efficiency was the name of the game. They couldn't just build a monster ship because the treaty literally said no.
Ruthless efficiency. The Ranger was significantly smaller than the Lexington class. We're talking about 14,000 tons versus 36,000 tons. But it carried a comparable number of aircraft, roughly 70 to 80 planes.
How do you fit the same number of planes on a ship that's less than half the size?
You strip away everything else. They achieved that by sacrificing armor and speed. It was pretty slow for a carrier, maxing out around 29 knots, and it had almost zero protection against torpedoes.
Yikes.
Yeah. But the flight deck. The flight deck was the absolute priority.
I was reading about the smokestacks in the technical notes. That seemed like a bizarre engineering choice to modernize. Can we talk about the folding stacks?
Oh, the folding stacks. Yes, this is my favorite detail. See, on a converted ship, the exhaust is just where the exhaust is. But on the Ranger, they were terrified that smoke would obscure the landing deck or choke the pilots as they were coming in for a landing.
Which is a totally valid concern if you're trying to land a fragile biplane on a moving ship.
Exactly. So they designed these 6 small smokestacks on each side of the ship, near the stern. And get this, they were hinged. Hinged. During flight operations, motors would actually rotate these smokestacks 90 degrees, so they were laying flat horizontally, sticking out the side of the ship like outriggers.
That sounds incredibly over-engineered.
It was, and it was highly problematic in rough seas because water would just wash right into them. But it shows that they were figuring this out as they went. They were learning the physics of air operations at sea. It was a class of one.
A class of one?
Yeah, they never built another Ranger because they learned so much from its flaws.
That's a key insight right there. Sometimes the prototype isn't the perfect model. It's the sacrificial lamb that teaches you what not to do.
Absolutely. But despite the flaws, when it was commissioned, it was a profound statement. It represented the Navy's physical aspiration to dominate the air at sea. And remember, in 1934, the battleship admirals were still running the show.
Right.
The idea that a fragile, flat-top ship would replace the mighty battleship was considered heresy by a lot of the old guard.
So the Ranger spends the late 30s proving the concept. Then the world breaks. December 1941, Pearl Harbor. The U.S. is thrust into the war. Now, usually the narrative immediately shifts to the Pacific. Midway, Coral Sea, the Zeros versus Wildcats. We've all seen the movies.
Right, that's the cinematic war.
But the Ranger doesn't go west to fight Japan. It goes east. Why?
It comes right back to those design decisions we just talked about. Because the Ranger lacked torpedo protection and top-tier speed, the Navy leadership was very hesitant to put it up against the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy hitters.
They didn't want it anywhere near those torpedoes.
Exactly. The Pacific was a vast ocean requiring high speed and heavy armor. So the Ranger became the beast of the Atlantic instead, the largest carrier in the U.S. Atlantic Fleet.
Which brings us to the neutrality patrols. I've always found that term to be such a contradiction. It sounds so bureaucratic.
It's basically diplomatic speak for undeclared naval war. Before the U.S. officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the Ranger was out there patrolling the Atlantic sea lanes, and you have to understand the environment. The Atlantic wasn't just an ocean. It was a hunting ground.
U-boats.
Roof packs of U-boats. So you have this high-value target, this massive carrier, playing cat and mouse with invisible submarines. The tension on board must have been excruciating. You aren't technically at war, but if a torpedo hits you, the result is exactly the same.
And once the war officially starts, the Ranger shifts gears immediately. It becomes this massive logistics lifeline. In early 1942, the sources say it started by ferrying Army P-40 Warhawks to West Africa. And this is interesting technically because P-40s aren't carrier planes. They don't have tailhooks.
Correct. This was a one-way ticket. The Ranger would load up with these heavy Army fighters, sail close enough to the coast of Africa, launch them, and they'd fly to bases in places like Accra to support the British in North Africa. It was projecting power by delivery.
But it wasn't just a delivery truck. We really need to talk about Operation Torch. November 1942, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. This is the Ranger's first real heavy-hitting combat test.
And it performed exceptionally well. This was the moment the 1930s experiment finally proved its worth. The Ranger was launching nearly continuous sorties for 3 days. Its aircraft Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers were hitting airfields, destroying Vichy French battleships, and providing close air support for the troops hitting the beaches.
This is where that keel-up design really paid off, right? The sheer efficiency of the deck cycle.
Absolutely. Despite being smaller than the converted carriers, the Ranger could cycle planes rapidly. It proved that a carrier could effectively suppress land-based defenses. It wasn't just fighting other ships, it was actively influencing the ground war.
But if we want to talk about the Ranger's most unique contribution, the operation that really distinguishes it from the Pacific War, we have to look at Operation Leader.
Operation Leader. August to November 1943.
The sources highlight the specific attack on October 4th, 1943. We aren't in the sunny Pacific. We aren't even in the Mediterranean. We are in Norway.
This is fascinating because it is the only time a U.S. carrier carried out a strike operation in northern European waters during the entire war.
Think about the geography here for a second. We are way up north.
The Arctic Circle.
The conditions were brutal. Freezing winds, rough seas, which remember the Ranger was not great in because of that stability issue with the folding stacks. But they moved north with the British home fleet to strike German shipping lines along the Norwegian coast.
And the Germans were totally caught off guard.
Completely. The intelligence reports from the time are incredible. They intercepted German radio traffic during the attack. The German operators were literally screaming, "Americaner! Americaner!" They could not believe a U.S. carrier was operating that far north. They thought they were completely safe. The sources detail the damage. 4 steamers sunk, 7 others damaged. Troop transports hit. It effectively severed their iron ore supply line for a significant period.
It was a surgical strike. And it demonstrated the strategic mobility of the carrier concept.
Yeah.
A carrier isn't just a weapon, it's a mobile airfield. You can be in Africa one month and the Arctic the next. It kept the Axis guessing.
Because they couldn't just fortify one area, the threat could move anywhere.
Precisely.
So by 1944, the Ranger has proven its worth. It's hunted subs, covered invasions, and raided the Arctic. But then, the Navy makes a massive pivot. The Ranger gets pulled from the front lines.
This is the life cycle of technology in war. By early 1944, the ship undergoes a major overhaul. The new Essex-class carriers were coming online. They were bigger, faster, and much better armored. The Ranger was essentially obsolete as a frontline combatant.
So they send it to the Pacific, but not to fight.
No. It becomes a training carrier. It ferries equipment and military passengers, but its primary role becomes a classroom. And honestly, I think this part of the Ranger's history is almost more important to the actual victory than the combat operations.
That is a big claim. You're saying the classroom was more important than the combat.
I am. Because wars are won by logistics and personnel. The Japanese were losing pilots and simply couldn't replace them. Their training programs were rigid and slow. The U.S., on the other hand, turned pilot training into an industrial assembly line.
I want to pull out a staggering statistic from the source notes here because it is just mind-boggling. Between August 9th, 1944 and February 1st, 1945, that's barely 6 months, the Ranger completed 14,863 carrier landings.
This is an astronomical number.
Let's do the math on that. That is roughly 80 landings a day, every single day, for 6 months.
And that includes bad weather days, day and night.
And night is the key word there. Night carrier landings are terrifying even today with computers and modern displays. In 1944, it was basically controlled crashing in the dark.
Imagine the stress. The deck crew, the landing signal officers, the young pilots.
It must have been immense.
But that intense grind is what won the war in the Pacific. By the time those pilots got to the forward fleet, landing on a pitching deck was second nature. They had prepared themselves through sheer repetition. They didn't have to think about flying. They could focus entirely on fighting.
You know, that idea of intense preparation feels like the perfect segue because our source stack takes a very sharp, almost jarring turn here. We go from combat logs and landing statistics to a document that references a scripture, Doctrine and Covenants 27.16.
It's a really interesting juxtaposition. We have these gritty details of war, freezing oceans, industrial training, and then suddenly this philosophical reflection on the armor of God.
For the listener, the quote provided in the source material is, "Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace."
And the source material draws a direct thematic link between the military concept of preparedness, those 14,000 rigorous landings, and personal internal preparedness.
It's framing that scriptural armor not just as a religious concept, but as a practical survival mechanism.
Right. Think about the pilot on the Ranger. He puts on a flight suit, checks his oxygen, straps into the harness. He is physically layering on protection. The argument the source is making is that individuals need to do the exact same thing psychologically and spiritually.
The source actually poses these reflective questions directly to the reader. How has truth benefited you? And in what ways does preparation help in a time of need?
It's asking us to view character defects almost like structural flaws in a ship.
It's a powerful analogy. If you have a weak keel, the ship breaks in the storm. It doesn't matter how nice the paint job is. If you don't have truth or righteousness, however you define those moral compass points in your own life, you break in a personal crisis.
It reminds me of the Ranger's lack of torpedo protection. That was a known vulnerability. The source seems to be asking, what are your vulnerabilities? And have you put in the daily reps to armor up against them?
It's all about resilience. The Ranger survived the war because it was utilized correctly, and the crew was endlessly trained. The argument is that humans need that same intentionality. You don't just hope you can handle a tragedy. You build the infrastructure of your character from the keel up before the storm hits.
Because readiness is a state of being. You are either ready or you are not. There's no middle ground when the plane is hitting the deck.
So the Ranger finishes its mission. It prepared thousands of pilots. The war ends, and then...
January 1947, it is decommissioned, and very shortly after, it was sold for scrap.
That part always stings a little. You have this heroic vessel, a true pioneer, and it ends up as razor blades.
It's the unsentimental nature of the military. It was obsolete. The technology had leaped forward so fast, partially because of the hard lessons learned on the Ranger, that it had no place in the post-war world.
But a piece of it remains, right?
Yes, there is a model of the Ranger at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C. But its real legacy is floating out there right now.
The modern descendant. The Ford class.
The USS Gerald R. Ford. Commissioned in July 2017. If the Ranger was 14,000 tons, the Ford is 100,000 tons. It is the gargantuan next-generation warship the sources talk about.
But here is where we run into a very modern conflict raised in the text. The Ranger was built because the U.S. was trying to be efficient with tonnage. The Ford is being built in an era where we are supposedly trying to be efficient with dollars, and the source explicitly asks, can the U.S. sustain a fleet of this size?
This is a massive debate. The plan is to build a fleet of 10 of these supercarriers over 2 decades. But the costs of the warships and the naval aircraft are rising rapidly.
We're talking billions upon billions of dollars.
Exactly. It's the preparedness paradox. We want the ultimate armor, the biggest, most advanced ship possible.
Yeah.
But if that armor is so expensive that it strains the entire system, are you actually more prepared? Or are you just overburdened?
It's the Ranger problem in reverse. The Ranger was almost too light, too vulnerable. The Ford might be too heavy, economically speaking.
And vulnerable in entirely new ways. In the 1930s, they worried about a submarine torpedo. Now they worry about hypersonic missiles.
So it brings us back to that fundamental idea of balance. Whether it's naval engineering or that internal preparedness we discussed, you need enough armor to survive the hit, but you still need to be able to move and sustain yourself.
You have to remain adaptable. The Ranger was successful because it adapted perfectly to its limitations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ocean. We started with a blueprint in 1933. We saw a ship with folding smokestacks fighting in the Arctic, churning out pilots in the Pacific, and eventually becoming scrap metal that paved the way for today's nuclear supercarriers.
A true pioneer.
But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We talked about the Navy building a fleet it might not be able to afford, and an individual heavily armoring themselves for personal crises. But what happens when the pursuit of absolute preparedness actually makes you too rigid to adapt? Oh.
That's a great point.
Right. What if true preparedness isn't about having the heaviest armor, but having the agility to survive when your armor inevitably fails? Where is the line between being well prepared and being entirely paralyzed by the weight of your own defenses? Something to think about the next time you're gearing up for a challenge. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.